What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1940s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the end of the 40s Project. Well, we've reached the ending of the 40s Project, and here's the deal. Because of the Hays Code, and because just a general lack of interest in the horror genre, there really weren't that many releases in the later years. So this episode is actually going to cover all of 1947, 1948, and 1949. So, even though there's not much of it, let's take a look to see what horror remains in this decade.
Believe it or not, but 1947 was one of the sparsest years for horror, and we don't actually have our first entry until September 18th in Paris, and we're kicking off with Fantomas. We're introduced to a young couple who are getting married, but it turns out that the man who was supposed to marry them was an imposter, and the actual mayor is dead, a victim of Fantomas, a notorious criminal. It seems that everyone thought that he was dead, but those rumors were greatly exaggerated, and it looks like the woman getting married was his daughter, and he's always wanted her to be a criminal with him, but she wants no part of it and just wants to marry Fandor. Right after, he interrupts a fancy socialite dinner to announce that he's demanding $1 billion in gold, or else he'll kill 1 million people in Paris. Fandor is a journalist reporting on the story and notes that overnight, 32 people have already died. The criminal has death traps built up and crushes some dudes in a room with a collapsing ceiling and has a co-conspirator named Maud. In order to hide his daughter from him, they choose to have another former criminal take her and Fandor in, but when Dandy Fandy goes off to try to take down the big bad solo, it's up to Helene and Arthur to go in and get him, and try to save the day from the villain and his new invention, a death ray. So, keep in mind, this was before the sci-fi boom of the 50s and after the decline of the Universal Monsters, and no one was really making horror films around this time. It's possible that's due to just going through the actual horrors of World War II, and that monsters weren't that scary in comparison. But this is sort of a crime horror flick from France by a man named Jean Sacha, and was his first film. The character of Fantomas was a very popular character in French literature and had been the subject of a series of novels that began back in 1911. Although there had been several versions of the villain brought to the screen in the past, most were in the silent era, and this was the first of two in this series, with the second one coming out in 1949, although that was more of a crime drama, so we won't be covering it when we get there. The more theatrical elements of the series were toned down here, with very few instances of Fantomas wearing his trademark costume, and a focus on death rays and mad scientists. And I'm just giving this one a 2. It's unfortunately way too slow-paced, and for a film about a supervillain with devious intent on taking over the world with science weapons, it's just dull. Its HCS is just a 1.5 since it's practically unknown here in the States, and I'll only give it the extra 0.5 for being a part of history for a decently well-known character. Should you watch it? You can pass. Our next one is our only other entry for 1947, and it came out in the UK on October 8th, and it looks like it didn't get a US run until 1951, and it's Uncle Silas. It's set in 1815, and we meet young Caroline, and her father talk about their infamous Uncle Silas, who has a hell of a reputation. There's some wild stuff going on, like some sort of mad woman running up to the house in the rain, and she also gets a new governess who is more strict than she'd like. She's aggressive enough that Caroline is legitimately afraid of her, but she also does suspicious stuff like snooping around the documents at night. She's caught though, and fired, but the question is raised as to where she got the key to get into the cabinets, with Papa realizing that she likely obtained it from none other than Silas. Right after, he passes away, and at his will reading, Silas sends a representative to find out about his allowance. However, It said that he's also made Caroline's sole guardian until she's either 21 or married. But if she were to die before that time is up, then Silas would get everything. When she finally comes face to face with her uncle, he's certainly an oddball with wild hair, but seems rather kind to Caroline. But it seems like he also has ulterior motives, and also a son with a mean streak. The old manor has secrets as well, and it looks like the plan is to kill Caroline in order to get the whole shebang for himself. And as I said earlier, there's not much horror going on right now, and this one could even fall into the drama category or thriller if it weren't for a few scenes that seemed more interested in scaring you than anything else. It was directed by Charles Frank, and like Jean-Sacha, this was also Frank's first directing gig. It was based on a novel from 1864 called Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, and it was a touch more lavish than other UK productions at this time. The cost was £366,000, which was the equivalent of around $1 million, and did get that US release a few years later, although here it was titled The Inheritance. It was a bomb, though, in both countries, only earning back around a third of the budget and then fell into obscurity. And this is pretty good. It's a 3. It's a little slow at times, but not boringly so, and Silas is just such a fun and devious character, as is Madame de la Rougierre. Its horror cultural significance is just a 1, though, since it's completely unknown now and doesn't really have any horror stars of note. Should you watch it? Yeah, but keep in mind that it's a touch dry. We're moving into 1948 now, and we're still not back in America since this is another British film, although it debuted in Hungary on February 23rd, making it to the UK on April 12th, and eventually the US on July 24th, and it's Corridor of Mirrors. We're introduced to a woman in a large estate with several children, and she has a secret that she sneaks off to see her lover. He sends her telegrams on where to meet, leading her to Madame Tussaud's, and spots a wax figure of a man said to have killed his lover and was hanged. There's then a flashback to 7 years earlier, and that killer is out at a nightclub and encounters Mifani, and she's transfixed by him right away. And yes, her name is Mifanwy. Mifanwy, a name I have never heard before, but it looks to be a Welsh name. Manjin becomes obsessed with her, saying that they were lovers in previous lives back in the Renaissance. They begin to see each other, and she feels like he's turning her into another person, and he starts to get more controlling. He also has a housekeeper named Veronica that tries to warn her away and says that she was also one of his former lovers, and she hits the end of her rope and has to walk out on him, but it seems like he won't actually let her. And it's funny that this is the third film in a row here that marks the first feature for a director, and this one is a bit of a bigger deal than most, since this is the debut film for Terrence Young. Of course, he'd go on to some massive successes and launched the James Bond film series with Dr. No. He'd also do 2 other Bond films and a run of cool action flicks, but that's not the only debut here, since sharp-eyed viewers will spot none other than Christopher Lee in the nightclub scenes. This was also his first feature film and only his second acting job. Also, like the 2 prior films, this was based on a book, this one by Chris Massey, and it was partially adapted by Edana Romney, who also plays Mifanwy in the film. It's said that it took 7 years to get the script filmed because she wrote it with Rudolph Cartier, and they shopped it around, and several studios were interested, but Romney also wanted to star in the film, and Cartier wished to direct. They were able to finally find some financing after Eric Portman showed interest in starring in it as well, but Cartier was unable to direct due to trade union objections. The film was critically acclaimed, but didn't make as big of an impact as they were hoping. And this is a very pretty film. It's a 3.5 from me. It does drag at times, and Rodney's not really that strong of an actress that the role needed, but the story's great and it looks phenomenal. The HCS is a 2 since it's not all that well known, but it did launch the careers of Young, even though he's not known for horror, and Lee, who surely is. Should you watch it? Yeah, take a look in this mirror.
Who are we all pulling to pieces this time?
Take a look. Standing in the entrance, Lord Byron.
Looks like we're staying on that other side of the ocean as we advance into the year to March 23rd in London for a film that wouldn't get a US release until 1953, and it's Horror Maniacs, or The Greed of William Hart. It begins in a pub with a couple of guys discussing the delivery of bodies to medical schools. There's then these two Irish guys, Hart and Moore, and if Hart here looks familiar, it's because it's our old friend Todd Slaughter, who we haven't seen since the beginning of the decade. One night, while drinking it up, a couple of young women stumble in, already drunk. Mary here talks to Moore and decides to go home with him, but then vanishes, so her friend goes to enlist the help of a local policeman. The two fellas have wives, and Moore's wife is played by an actress named Jenny Lynn, and she was Slaughter's real-life wife. She only appeared in 2 films, this one and The Ticket of Leave Man, both of which had Slaughter in them. Their ladies want them to stop their shady businesses and get real jobs because Hart and Moore have chosen to just murder people and then sell their bodies to those medical schools. The town medic thinks that something is up and continues to search for Mary, knowing that she was last seen at their house. But it turns out that the head of the school likes getting fresh bodies and helps the boys cover up their deeds. So, if any of this sounds familiar, it's likely because you know about Burke and Hare. They were a real-life pair of criminals from the early 1800s who would murder at least 16 people and then sold their bodies for medical study. The names are changed here from Burke and Hare to Hart and Moore, and the corrupt doctor is Cox, similar to his real-life counterpart, Dr. Knox. The original intent was to actually adapt the real-life events, and it was filmed that way, but the Board of Censors said no, and asked for all of the details to be changed. They then had to go in and overdub the actors anytime the names of Burke, Hare, or Knox were said, but could leave the victims or heroic characters alone. It's said that doing this was more expensive than they had planned, and they had to use that portion of the budget set aside for music to take care of it, which is why the film has no score track. And this is fine, I'll go 2.5 with it. It takes too long to get to the point, and the setup of the crimes just doesn't come quick enough. It's got more interesting stuff happening in the back portion of the film, but just not enough to boost it any higher. The HCS is only at a 1.5 since it's another that's mostly unknown, but it's a famous story and has Slaughter in it. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's okay, and it's kind of funny to hear all the inserts anytime someone says one of their names.
Mr. Moore's giving a nice...
If ever we have to cheat the gallows that way, Mr. Hart, I'd be choosing something other than rat poison.
Didn't she, Mr. Moore?
She did so.
I'm starting to think that the US is never going to make horror again because we're still in the UK, and this next one premiered there on June 11th, not landing in the US until 1952, and it's House of Darkness. It gives us a composer who's working on some new music and being interviewed about his inspiration for it, and he tells a story about encountering a strange house while on a walk. It's a big spooky mansion, and he hears the sound of music emanating from it and investigates. Inside is a man playing piano, and another on the violin, and it seems like this is a remembrance of a previous time, so we're now in a flashback within a flashback. In it, a young man named Francis, played by Lawrence Harvey, is accused of fraud by wealthy John and told to come clean, but then has an attack and is bedridden. Francis is John's younger brother, and he's known for being a rake, while Big Bro controls the family purse strings and wants to cut him off completely. So, the two have a battle of wits. The younger brother wins that when John's heart is just too weak to deal with it all, but it seems like his spirit isn't ready to give up the fight. Then, when the family decides to sell off their parts of the house, Francis opts to get the whole thing for himself. So this one was by Oswald Mitchell, and as opposed to the earlier films here where they were director's first features, this was one of Mitchell's final works. He'd been directing since the mid-30s, but died in '49 at the age of 51, with only 2 movies after this one. But what I admitted earlier is that he was also the director of Horror Maniacs, and he made House of Darkness immediately afterwards. This one was based on a radio play called Duet by Betty Davies that ran in 1947, and it was the first film for Lawrence Harvey. He got some good write-ups for playing a jerkish guy here, and a good amount of roles he took on later accentuated his ability to play these charming cads. It got decent reviews, but many of them pointed out that it seemed to follow an outdated formula of the old Dark House films and just didn't make that big of a splash. And I agree, it's a 2. It just feels so dated and dry with only Harvey's performance to perk things up. Its HCS is a 1 though, since it's almost veritably unknown and unheard of with very little in terms of horror names to give it interest. Should you watch it, you can leave this house unoccupied. Okay, we're finally heading back to the US and back to the Universal Monsters, but not in the way that you'd expect, because on June 15th, the Titans again clashed with Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. It kicks off with Lon Chaney Jr. returning as Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, and we then have Abbott and Costello, or I guess Wilbur and Chick as their characters are named here. They're working as baggage clerks for a train, and Wilbur has an attractive girlfriend that Chick can't figure out why she's into him. Talbot calls the guys, trying to warn him about a shipment coming in that he says is dangerous, but then the full moon causes him to transform, even though the last time that we saw him in House of Dracula, he was said to have been cured. The owner of the crates arrives and says that the crates contain the bodies of Dracula and Frankenstein, and when the fellas go to unload and deliver the packages, sure enough, spooky shenanigans kick off. Of course, Wilbur is the only one that sees them happen, which is the A and C formula. Weird things occur, Costello sees it, but Abbott doesn't and never believes him when he tells him. When we finally get to see Drac wake up and walk around, it's none other than Bela Lugosi, returning to the role for the first time since the 1932 original film. He awakens the monster, but if you were looking for Karloff to return to the role as well, that doesn't happen here, as he's again played by Glenn Strange, continuing as the creature after sporting the makeup in his past 2 appearances. The Count takes the monster away to Dr. Mornay, who turns out to be Wilbur's girlfriend, as she's chosen him for his simplistic brain, which she intends to take and implant in the monster's body to make him more obedient. Things get more complicated when the boys meet up with Talbot and his furrier side, but there's also an insurance investigator named Joan on their case, and she is played by Jane Randolph, who we've seen in both Cat People movies, but this would be her last role before marrying, mostly retiring and moving to Spain. Eventually, everyone ends up at Dr. Mornay's castle, where Wilbur's brain is in danger, and the monsters collide. So, keep in mind, in this period, the Universal Monsters were basically done. The studio was flailing and dropped a bunch of their contract players and weren't moving forward with any of their existing franchises. Also, at about this time, Abbott and Costello weren't getting along, and they were dealing with health issues and a lagging popularity. But then the idea rose to bring the duo into the world of the monsters, even though initially they both hated the script. They were also problematic on set, often not showing up for filming, but the problems extended to issues with the monsters as well, with shooting accidents leading to a broken foot for Strange. The budget was decent at around $800,000, and it went on to be a huge hit. It was actually the most successful Frankenstein-related film since the original, and was one of the highest grossing films of the year, earning over $3 million. The reviews were actually mixed at the time, but it went on to be one of the more noted horror comedies of the era and deemed one of the best of the genre. There were those that weren't that happy about it, though, as Chaney Jr. claimed that the duo ruined horror films because they made monsters silly.
Well, then it's going to cost you overtime because I'm a union man, and I work only 16 hours a day.
A union man only works 8 hours a day.
I belong to 2 unions.
And I love this one, so it's a 4. I know that the plot is a bit all over the place and just rides on coincidence, but the comedy holds up, and everyone seems to be giving it their all. After watching so many of this type of film throughout the 1940s, it's wild just how much this one lands the format and the humor. Its HCS is a 4 as well, since it's very well known and has become one of the most known funny monster flicks out there. Plus, it featured several major monsters, including Bela returning to Dracula, and even a Vincent Price cameo/non-cameo. Should you watch it? Absolutely, and get ready to laugh.
Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get in on the excitement.
Who said that?
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
A couple of weeks later, on July 29th, shock of shocks, we're staying in the US, and we're staying with a more traditional horror film with the amazing Mr. X. We begin on a beach, and there's a fancy home overlooking the ocean where Christine lives. She thinks she hears a voice calling her from the sea, the voice of her husband who died 2 years earlier. She's been talking to a new man now, Martin, and is all set to meet up with him in person for the first time. First, though, she takes a walk on the beach, hearing that voice again, and encounters a strange man who seems to know all about her. He's Turin Bey, who was Mehmet Bey back in the Mummy's Tomb, but we also saw him in 44's The Climax. He disappears, and Christine meets up with Martin, and he's Richard Carlson, who we last saw back in Hold That Ghost and The Ghost Breakers. They get engaged, but that night the voice calls to her again, and pictures switch, causing Christine to think that Paul is trying to tell her not to marry Martin. She's compelled to seek out Alexis for advice and sees unexplainable things at his place. Christine's little sister and Martin are concerned by her visits to Alexis and hire a detective to prove that he's a fraud and go undercover to reveal his identity as a con man. But things take a much more complicated turn when it turns out that there's more to Paul's death than previously expected. And who is conning who? This one was originally called The Spiritualist and was also originally going to be done at PRC, one of the Poverty Row studios, but ended up at a different company called Eagle Lion Films when the prior company shut down. Bernard Voorhaus directed, and he'd done a bunch of war films throughout the 40s, but this is his first genre flick that he'd handle, but he'd only do a few more films before being blacklisted in the whole McCarthy era. There's a tragedy involved with this film in that the part of Christine was originally meant to be played by an actress named Caroline Landis, who hasn't really appeared on the project but had a number of bigger roles like in 1 Million BC and Topper Returns, and she was meant to head up this film, but mere days before production began, she took her own life over complications with her difficult marriage that she escaped and a later affair with a married actor who refused to leave his wife for her. After her death, Lynn Barry stepped in on extremely short notice to take the role. There's not much info on how well it did, but it seems that it performed well enough for the studio to be pleased with the results, although it's said that audiences laughed at parts of the film that they were not intending to be funny. And I like this fine. It's a 3. There's a lot going on here, and it doesn't quite make all of it work, but it's engaging and interesting with some great character bits. Its HCS is just a 1 though, since it's mostly brushed under the rug and just didn't have the star power that it needed to stand out. Should you watch it? Yeah, Mr. X predicts that you will. We're on a roll in the US now, and this next one debuted on September 1st, and let's check out The Creeper. We begin with a young woman, seemingly in a trance, taking a gun around the house. Her dad puts her back into bed, and the next day in a medical laboratory where she works, Nora is still a bit dazed. She works with her father, and he's Ralph Morgan, and this is a weird footnote because he was a fairly known actor, but his little brother had a bigger claim to fame because he played the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. They're expecting this shipment of serum that arrives damaged, and it was something that they worked on in the West Indies with cats. There's a scientist named Jim that works next door, and he's dating Gwen, the other employee at the lab, and works for Dr. Glock. His lab has a cat there named Creeper, and it just so happens that Nora is deathly afraid of cats and drops the serum. That night, she envisions a large, clawed pawed creature trying to get into her room, and Creeper has gone missing, although he eventually comes back because it must be dinner time. Nora tells them where her fear began back when they were in the Indies, but then it seems like Gwen and her father are up to something nefarious. Soon, Dr. Cavini turns up dead, clawed to death as if by some sort of giant cat. At first, Nora is their main suspect, but she's soon cleared. But is she some sort of cat person? Is Creeper out there killing people? This one was produced by a lower budget studio called Reliance Pictures, but was released by 20th Century Fox. It was a low budget horror film and one of the only ones from the era that did this sort of story. There was a touch of confusion considering that Universal had just had that series of films with Rondo Hatton where he played a killer that was called the Creeper, but by this point Hatton had passed away and there's no links to the story here. The director was Jean Yarbrough, and to make things more confusing, he had also directed The Brute Man, which featured the Creeper character. We saw him several more times before that as well, with She-Wolf of London, House of Horrors, and King of the Zombies. This one didn't get much attention, but it did get a lawsuit, considering that there was a popular radio show called The Creeper at the time, and they sued over the use, settling out of court. And this is okay, I'll give it a 2.5. It's interesting and all, but it just feels like it's trying to do too much, but too slowly, although it's never dull. The significance is just a 1.5 since it's really obscure, but I'll give it the 0.5 for being the only film of its kind from this particular point in time. Should you watch it? I'd actually say yes, because it has a cat in it. Let's take a slight jump now to October and close out 1948 with a film that's perhaps a bit indicative of what the 50s will hold, and it's Unknown Island. This is coming at you in glorious Cinecolor and starts in Singapore as Ted and Carol enlist the services of a drunken lout named Captain Tarnowski. It seems they want him to take them to this island where they claim that dinosaurs exist, since Ted was a Navy pilot and during the war flew over an island where he saw them. Turns out that he believes them, but mainly because he knows a guy who was shipwrecked there and claims to be lucky to have survived, and they all head out. Problem is, the crew finds out where they're going and try to mutiny, but they're stopped and have to continue on. They reach the island, spotting a brontosaurus from the shore and prep to leave the ship, all while Fairbanks flirts with Carol. They immediately encounter a Dimetrodon, and also a pair of Ceratosaurus, some awesome guys in suits. They continue to have odd encounters with a giant sloth, but the trouble erupts when Ted is happy to get his pictures and head out there, but the captain insists on trying to capture one of the dinos to bring back alive, and get a cool $1 million. Although Carol just wants to go home, and grows closer and closer to Fairbanks along the way. And the color here is that Cinecolor process that I've talked about in some of the earlier episodes, but it was a cheaper color process that only used 2 colors. Everything is tones of green and red minus the blues that were introduced in Technicolor. So if the tones seem off, that's why. It was directed by Jack Bernard, and he was only involved in a handful of films, but was a producer as well, but just never had that big hit of a film. This one has a notorious story to it as well. In the scene, with all the guys advancing at them, they shot it with actors in suits in the California desert. It was so hot out, one of the actors collapsed and then later died due to heat exhaustion. Bernard then decided to leave the shot in the film where he collapses, having the troop knock it down with grenades to explain the dino falling. It did pretty well considering the budget was around $400,000, a somewhat pricey venture for the era, and it pulled in around $1 million. But hey, it has dinosaurs, so it was bound to be successful, right? And this is fun. It's a 3. It's pretty lightweight, and it's just King Kong minus Kong, but it has its moments, and there's always something happening. Plus, I'm a sucker for dudes in big rubber monster suits. Its HCS is just a 2 though, since it's not that well known, but did have a bit of an impact for big dino movies, but just not as much as something like The Lost World did. Should you watch it? Yep, I'd book a trip to this island. Here we go, capping off this decade by heading into 1949, which was also a very light year for horror. But back in the UK, on March 18th, there was The Queen of Spades, a movie that would get a US run a little later in the year. A text screen tells us that we're in 1806 and there's a card game called Pharaoh that's popular in Russia and the evil influence of the Queen of Spades. There's a group of soldiers and a captain named Herman who loves to watch everyone gamble, but never plays himself because he's afraid of losing money. He hears tale of an old woman, Countess Renovskaya, who grew wealthy with some sort of card game secret. He seeks out information about her, finding an old book that tells the story of Countess R, a woman who found a secret and ends up selling her soul for great success with gambling. Herman believes that this woman is Renovskaya and decides to seek her out. She's an elderly woman and has a young ward named Lizaveta, and a love triangle forms between her, Herman, and one of Herman's friends, Andre. Andre is actually interested in her, although Herman simply wants to use her to get into the Countess's confidence to obtain her secret, and for a good chunk of the film it's more of a period drama than anything else. But then, at around the 1 hour mark, Herman confronts the Countess to get the answer, but she dies, and at her funeral, she opens her eyes. Later, her spirit calls out to him and tells him the secrets of the cards, but says that he must marry Lizaveta, which he finds a touch difficult. So, this is another British film because America is still staying away from horror, although it did get a US release through Republic. Thorold Dickinson was the director, and again, he didn't have a massive filmography with only 16 director's credits, and a chunk of those were shorts. This was an adaptation of a short story from 1834 called The Queen of Spades by Alexander Pushkin, and writer Rodney Ackland was one of the screenwriters and was originally slated to direct. However, just a few days before filming, after several arguments with the producer and stars, he was let go. The film was a bit of a bust at the box office and didn't get great reviews, although it was praised for its style and costumes, but then it was considered lost. A print was then discovered and restored in 2009, bringing it back to the film world. And I'll give this one a 3. It's really pretty and so well put together, but I'll confess I found it a bit dry, and it could have used a bit more of the manic energy it brought at the end. The HCS is just a 1 though, since it's not well known at all and doesn't have much in the way of known horror faces. Should you watch it? I'd say yeah, I'd bet on this queen. The end of the decade is near as we go to the United States again and back to horror comedy with August 22nd's Bud Abbott and Lou Costello meet the killer Boris Karloff. We're in a hotel and Abbott is here and hears about a famous lawyer named Strickland who's checking in, and Costello is here too as the bellboy. He's fired right away because of Strickland and says he'll get even with him. But then, when he instead goes to his room to apologize, it turns out that he's dead and the killer's still there. Casey is the hotel detective and he believes that Freddy is innocent and wants to help him clear his name, and it turns out that there's several other people staying there that are prime suspects. One is a Swami, and that's Boris Karloff, and this is his first appearance since 1945's Isle of the Dead, but he was keeping busy with non-horror projects between them. Another is Angela, played by Lenore Aubert, who played Mornay in A&C Meet Frankenstein. The group of Strickland's former associates all decide that it's best if Freddy take the rap for the crime, so they plan to get him to sign a confession and kill himself. Too bad for them that their plans don't work out as smoothly as they plan, and then more bodies start showing up, so it's up to the boys to figure out who the real killer or killers are before the police pin it all on them. Oddly enough, this script began his life as a vehicle for Bob Hope, but Universal ended up buying it and retooling it for Bud and Lou. But even then, it was titled Abbott and Costello Meet the Killers. But just a few days before they started filming, they hired Karloff and did some last-minute reworking to have him be the Swami character, which was originally a woman. The actual title of the film is Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, but because of how it's shown on screen, it's usually all spelled out with Karloff's name. This one was directed by Charles Barton, and he also did their Frankenstein meetup and had done a few other films with the duo, including Africa Screams. This had a slightly lower budget than the previous film at around $750K, and it wasn't as big of a hit, but was still a solid moneymaker, bringing in just under $2 million. It was rough going though, because right after they finished filming, Costello came down with a relapse of rheumatic fever and was bedridden, causing him to take a year break in between features. And this one's not as good as Frankenstein, but it's still tons of fun, so I'll give it a 3.5. The boys' comic timing is still on point, and that finale in the caves is great stuff. Its HCS is just a 2.5 though, since this is the least talked about of the A&C monster team-ups, but it's still fairly known and has that classic duo versus Karloff himself. Should you watch it? Yes, you should meet the killers as well. So close now, and this is a weird one because we're headed over to Japan, because on September 28th we had the release of The Invisible Man Appears. We're introduced to a couple of scientists who are discussing the idea of making something invisible and the problems that would arise with the theories. The younger scientists are rivals not only for their career, but for romantic interest. But it turns out that the doc is working on an invisibility serum that indeed works. He shows it works on a guinea pig, but says that it has side effects to prevent him from doing it on a human subject. But a neighborhood cat gets into it, making him invisible, so things just seem to magically get knocked off shelves. And man, this cat is clumsy, or just, an asshole. Things start to ramp up when the doc vanishes and leaves a note saying that he tested the formula out on himself, and right afterwards, this familiar-looking bandaged man appears at a jewelry store, strips down to nothing, and robs the place. Everyone wonders if it can truly be the kindly professor, and it seems like a priceless necklace called the Tears of Amour might be the next target. And this is such a curiosity of a film. Keep in mind, this is right after World War II, and Japan was recovering from the devastation of the atomic bombs. After the war, the public had increased exposure to American cinema since our troops were occupying the country, and US films were screening, leading to more American themes being introduced. It was directed by Nobuo Adachi, and this was only his second film and would go on to be his work of most note. The invisible effects were carried out by Eiji Tsuburaya, and his career was troubled. During the war, he did work for the government making propaganda films, so afterwards he was blacklisted from studio work. In order to get around this, he had to start up his own company and work as an independent contractor that directors would work directly with. It was during this period that he was hired to do this film, although he would eventually get back into good graces with the studios, and is the man who would both help create Godzilla and Ultraman. This was popular enough to get a sequel in 1957 with The Invisible Man vs. the Human Fly, although it doesn't appear to be connected and is just a different invisible dude. And this is okay, it's a 2.5. The effects are all stuff that we've seen before in the American versions, and the plot is a touch of a mess, but it's entertaining enough. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not much known in the US, although likely has more relevance to Japan, but it's a familiar title and had Tsuburaya's involvement. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's not hard to watch, but maybe hard to see? Because it's invisible. The final film of the decade, capping off the 1940s, is a weird pick, but since there was so little actual horror at this time, they all are. But premiering in Washington, D.C. on October 5th and getting a wider run in the U.S. of January of 1950, it's The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. It begins in a library, and a book talks about Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows, and the voiceover is by Basil Rathbone, Sherlock himself. A rat is delivered mail by a human postman, which seems weird, right? Like there's a mole in the rat, and they're just like on this mailman's route. They're invited to Toad Hall, where Mr. Toad lives, and he's in financial trouble. His friend Angus McBadger is doing his accounting, and there's other people here too. So like, what's everyone eat? And like, there's a horse here, and it talks too. So this is just a world where every animal can talk, I suppose. And initially I was gonna skip over this segment because it's not horror, and the reason for including it was the Headless Horseman stuff later. But this is a universe in which all the animals talk, which means that everyone either has to be vegan or kill speaking animals that can plead for their own lives. There's a strong possibility that this is a world with cattle farms and cows are just like yelling for help. Anyway, though, there's also weasels that shouldn't laugh, although laugh themselves to death. But at the very end, it's Christmas and they're freaking eating a turkey. These talking animals are chowing down on another talking animal that possibly was strolling around with clothes on the day before. But the second story is why this movie is on here, because it's the legend of Sleepy Hollow and introduces us to good old Ichabod Crane, the new teacher in the town, and he's a bit of an outcast. He falls for Katrina, who is surprisingly buxom for a Disney girl, and here he has a rivalry with Gaston like Brom. There's a local legend of the Headless Horseman, a ghost that searches the woods looking to replace the noggin that he lost, and that night, Crane has to find out if that legend is indeed true. So, this was a Disney production, distributed through RKO, and started life way back in 1940 as a full-length feature of The Wind in the Willows. After a number of false starts and problems along the way, including an animator strike, it looked like it was never going to be completed. It was shelved in 41, returned to production in 43, shelved again in 46, and then the decision was made to use what they had for a short, and they combined it with a concept to do a Headless Horseman movie, shortened as well. After it finally completed, it was a decent-sized hit, earning $1.2 million, but then it really became a big deal in the home market much later on. It would get a number of TV screenings, both as the full feature and also as separate stories, and Sleepy Hollow would go on to be a long-running Halloween favorite. It even won a Golden Globe for cinematography and a large amount of critical praise. And how do you not have nostalgia for this? It's a 3.5. I hadn't seen it in a while, but I used to watch the Sleepy Hollow parts all the time when I was younger, and it's still really charming and fun. Its HCS is a 3.5 as well. I don't know how to rate this because a chunk of it isn't horror, but I feel like the Ichabod part has become so much a part of the spooky season that there's no way to not give it a higher rank just based on that. Should you watch it? You should. Go for this wild ride.
So there you have it, all of the horror of the 1940s. And my favorite of this particular block is probably Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, for obvious reasons. Not a lot to choose from here, but it's still a solid one. But let's take a look at some of the best of this entire decade.
For best effects, that's going to go to Dr. Cyclops. Yes, I really enjoyed all of the big and little stuff that they did in this with the miniatures and the back screening. A lot of good stuff happening here. For best so bad it's good, I just have to give that one to the Devil Bat, what with Bela Lugosi hamming it up and that silly screeching bat. There's just so much fun. For most WTF, I'm giving this for a slightly different reason. This is going to go to Curse of the Cat People, mainly because it's a sequel to Cat People and has no cat people in it, and really isn't a sequel. It's very strange, but very, very good. With our most unique film, I'm going to give that to Dead of Night. This is the movie that set the standard for anthologies. Really great having all these different stories that ultimately weave together. It was a first of its kind and really unique. As our most overrated, I'm going to give that to Phantom of the Opera. This version, because it's part of the Universal series and because it's full color, it tends to get a lot of accolades and gets lumped in, but I don't think it's that great. It's mostly opera and not as interesting as the previous versions. For the most underrated, let's give that to Seventh Victim. This is a gorgeous movie that's doing a whole lot. Looks great, fantastic story and really isn't nearly as talked about as it should be. And finally, as our most amazing movie of the decade, of the entire 1940s, this was a tough one, but for me, personally, I'm giving this to Cat People. This movie's fantastic, it's gorgeous, it doesn't look like anything else from this era, and it is amazing.
Okay, well, we've reached the ending of the 40s, so you know what that means. That's right, we're moving on to the 50s. Debuting next month, prepare yourself for the 50s project, because it's coming. And I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, click on that like button. Subscribe if you enjoy the channel, if you want notified when that 50s project starts up. And of course, check out the Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support all of the projects. And thank you very much for coming to watch this. And this has been the 40s Project.